I'm live. Well, good afternoon. It's great to see so many people turning out on a rather blistery day. My name is Don Steluto. I have the pleasure of being the co-director for the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, also known as the CCCG. On behalf of the CCCG and our co-sponsors, the Department of Africana Studies, the Department of Theology, and the Initiative on Race and Resilience, it is a pleasure to welcome you here and to those watching online to this talk by Justin Giboney. Before progressing any further, let me also offer our sincere thanks to the CCCG staff, Anna, Lauren, Harv, Helena, and Tyler. Without these folks, the things that we do would not be successful. Norman Mailer, the American writer and filmmaker who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and wrote 12 novels, is on record saying that Notre Dame was one of his favorite places because he could talk about the soul here and nobody laughed at him. In a world that often discounts the spiritual and the normative, it's not uncommon to be scorned a bit for one's faith. However, as Justin knows, we continue to talk about the soul and all things spiritual here, and still no one laughs. This is a good thing, as our presenter today will challenge us to take seriously the charge many of us have been given as Christians and how we engage the culture war of our present age. In his recent book, Don't Let Nobody Turn You Around, from which today's talk was based, Justin Giboney articulated the duty of Christians to engage those with whom they disagree according to principles of faith, even while doing so with charity. In his book, he draws on historical examples from the Black church to demonstrate the lessons and the power of civil dialogue, infused with Christian hope and conviction and directed to a common good. He gave particular attention to the Black church social action tradition, which, as he writes, engaged the public square without separating religion from socio-political advocacy. In his book, he is unapologetic, a quality he advocates, writing, our public witness is our testimony to the world about what is good and true and what is false and immoral. Our public witness tells others what we value, represent, and whom we serve. It can teach, encourage, make peace, and tear down wicked institutions. Justin engages the CCCG community exactly where we operate daily. Our students regularly meet with major figures in American public and academic life to discuss, question, and debate civilly the principles and developments in American political life, constitutional governance, and law. To this, Justin offers us some interesting new perspectives. After talking with Justin last night when we had dinner and reading his book, it is clear that this is a man with many talents who has thought seriously about how he can serve God and impact the world. And he has made beautiful choices about where to apply his gifts and talents. He can offer us much to reflect on for our vocations. At the CCCG, we have a tradition of asking one of our students to introduce our guest, and it is my pleasure to introduce Madeline Moss. Madeline is currently a Tocqueville Fellow at the Center. She's originally from Great Falls, Virginia, and a sophomore pursuing majors in the program of liberal studies and Italian, as well as minors in business economics and theology. With that, I'll turn it over to Madeline to introduce Justin Giboney.
Justin Giboney is the co-founder and president of the AND campaign, a Christian civic organization focused on raising civic literacy, promoting civic pluralism, and equipping Christians to engage politics with the love and truth of Jesus Christ. An ordained minister, attorney, and political strategist, Mr. Giboney has been published in the New York Times and Christianity Today, and he is the co-author of the book Compassion and Conviction. His most recent book, which he will be drawing from in his lecture today, is Don't Let Nobody Turn You Around: How the Black Church's Public Witness Leads Us Out of the Culture War. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Giboney to Notre Dame.
Well, thank you, Madeline, for that kind introduction. I appreciate it, and I just want to thank everyone that's here. Also, let me rush to thank Professor Munoz, Professor Don Saludo, who we had an excellent conversation yesterday. It's never easy to talk to an introvert throughout dinner, but he made it happen and got some answers out of me, so I appreciate that. Also want to say thank you to Professor Mark Sanders and the whole team, Lauren, Tyler Castle, who's a friend of mine, and it's always good to see you. So thank you for having me. I can tell earlier today I had breakfast with some students and some fellows, and I could tell by the questions they were asking that this program is well worth what Notre Dame is putting into it. Very thoughtful questions. I can tell they were listening to my presentation and really trying to dig deeper into the subject matter. So I appreciate what you all are doing and certainly appreciate the invitation. Well, as you know, I've come here today to talk about what it looks like to be a faithful Christian in the culture war. And if we're all going to be honest, as we look at the polarization, and I don't have to tell any of you how polarized and divided we are today, I don't think people look and say the reaction to this or the correct response to this is just look at those Christians over there. They're doing this perfectly. We should follow them. Sadly, I don't think anyone's saying that. The good thing is, in the past, we did have groups of Christians who were that model. And all is not lost for us to become that model. And so when I wrote my book, Don't Let Nobody Turn You Around, I did so in part because I think not only the country, but I think Christians in America are losing sight of that civil rights legacy, of the lessons that we were taught through that ethos. and how they conducted themselves. Yes, we celebrate MLK Day, as I hope most of us did over the weekend, over the holiday weekend. But do we really dig in? Do we treat it like something that's at a museum that was cute, that we can go see when we like to, and it's good to look at? Or do we actually try to apply the messages and all the things that they brought to us? That's the question we all have to answer. And if not, hopefully this lecture helps us get closer to how we can do that. I almost forgot, Harv is actually the one that picked me up from the airport, so I don't want to go without thanking Harv. He was a very gracious host, and so thank you for your hospitality. I greatly appreciate that. So before I dig deep into what the book's talking about, I think it would be helpful to tell you a little bit about my organization, which comes out of the tradition that I'll be talking about a little later. As you heard from Madeline, the AND Campaign is a Christian civic organization, and we're focused on helping Christians be a little less partisan and less ideological, and more so focused on Christian principles. And one of the ways that we approach that is by seeing the landscape. So if we look at the Christian landscape, I think we have two sets of Christians. I think we have Christians who are all about morality, so we can say those are the morality Christians. They talk a lot about morality. And then we have the Christians that talk a lot about justice. And I think both those things are part of the Bible. The problem is they're supposed to come together. That we're not supposed to either be morality Christians or justice Christians. Justice and morality through the gospel come together. We're not just supposed to be about love. We're supposed to be about love and truth. And if you don't believe me, we can go to the scripture. If you go to Ephesians 4, verses 14 through 15, listen to what Paul says to the church of Ephesus. This is the persevering church. And they happen to have at this time false teachers who were trying to spread false doctrine in the church. And this is what Paul says to them as he's talking about maturity. He says, "Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead," listen to this, "speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ." Speaking the truth in love. The gospel is certainly love, but it's not the type of love that would be formless, that wouldn't have definition. Truth gives love definition. The gospel is certainly truth, but we know that the gospel isn't just black letter law. Love gives the truth some compassion. It allows us to relate to others and honestly be honest with ourselves. So the AND campaign, the reason we named it the AND campaign is because we believe Christians can't be about love or truth. We have to be love and truth. Not about justice or moral order, that we have to be about justice and moral order, compassion and conviction. It's only through combining those things that are not in conflict, although the world and the culture war may present it that way. By combining those things, we get closer to what a gospel application in the public square looks like. And if you want examples of these, I'll talk about some of the people who I think are great examples of this. I think you can look at a Fannie Lou Hamer and how she conducted her life. I think you can look at a Dorothy Day and how she conducted herself to say those two probably wouldn't have fit in either party right now, but they got something that I'm not sure we get today, right? And so that's how the AND campaign looks at these issues and tries to approach them. So one of the reasons that I wrote this book, as you heard, is because I wanted to remind the church especially, but America in general, about the principles that we learned through this amazing movement. Because I think we lose. I think we talk about them. I don't think we actually engage with them. But I also wanted to correct some kind of revisionist history when it comes to the civil rights movement in general. Some would say, some on the left would say, because I think everyone tries to co-opt it for their own narrative. Some on the right would say that it was all about colorblindness. And I was just talking to Dr. King's daughter not too long ago, and she said he talked about getting to that point. He wasn't saying that we can pretend there are no racial issues and just jump to that point, right? And so I wanted to be very clear that that's not what the movement was about. But I also wanted to be clear that this was a Christian movement, that it should not be secularized, that many of the people that were part in the pews and fueling this movement believed in the authority of Scripture and were moving based on that authority. So it wouldn't fit easily as a progressive movement either. And I wanted to be very clear about that. So let's talk about, since the book is about how this tradition can lead us out of the culture war, first I think we need to define what the culture war is. What is this culture war that we find ourselves in? American sociologist James Davison Hunter defined the culture war as a struggle between progressives and conservatives over the national identity, over the meaning of America. It was a battle for power and cultural dominance, and it manifests in political and social hostility rooted in different systems of moral understanding. One way to see the culture war is the sexual revolution versus the moral majority, right? That's one example of that we see. It's this battle for cultural dominance, and where does truth come from? Does truth come somewhere from above all of us, and we have to follow it, or does it actually come from us as individuals? That's one of the big conversations we see here. So he defines it as a battle between progressives and conservatives, but he digs a little deeper and says that it's actually a battle, and has always been a battle, between white progressives and white conservatives, and that no other group was really a principal within this debate. There are two speeches, just to flesh this out a little bit, there are two speeches that I think clearly draw the lines of the culture war. The first one comes in 1992 in Pat Buchanan's address to the Republican National Convention. He kind of details the contours of this war from a conservative perspective as George H.W. Bush was preparing to take on Arkansas governor at the time, Bill Clinton. And here's what Pat Buchanan had to say. He said, "Ronald Reagan made us proud to be Americans again. We never felt better about our country, and we never stood taller in the eyes of the world than when the Gipper was at the helm. Mr. Clinton, however, has a different agenda. At its top is unrestricted abortion on demand. A militant leader of the homosexual rights movement rose at the Democratic National Convention and said, 'Bill Clinton and Al Gore represent the most pro-lesbian, pro-gay ticket in history.' And so they do. He goes on to say, 'The agenda that Clinton and Clinton would impose on America, abortion on demand, a litmus test for the Supreme Court, discrimination against religious schools, women in combat, that's change, all right. But it's not the kind of change America needs. It's not the kind of change America wants. And it's not the kind of change we can abide in a nation that we still call God's country. God bless you, and God bless America.' During that same election cycle, a month earlier, New York Governor Mario Cuomo offered an alternative vision of progress and inclusion. So this is how he labels it. And he said this is what Americans should follow. Here's what Cuomo had to say. 'Bill Clinton believes, as we all do here, in the first principle of our democratic commitment, the politics of inclusion, the solemn obligation to create opportunities for all people of whatever color, of whatever creed, of whatever sex, of whatever sexual orientation, all of them equal members of the American family. That is the fundamental democratic predicate. Surrender that principle, and we might as well tear the donkeys from our lapels and pin elephants instead. America needs Bill Clinton for yet another reason. We need a leader who will stop the Republican attempt through laws and the courts to tell us what God to believe in and how to apply that God's judgment to our to our schoolrooms and our bedrooms and our bodies." So you get two very different ideas of what America should be about. One centered on family values, one centered on progress and inclusion. And this starts to create what would become the culture war of today. There was an interesting survey that probably came out about 4 years ago that spoke on these lines, and it was called the Hidden Tribes. It was a Hidden Tribes survey. And what they did is they broke down America, I think, into 10 or more tribes, like ideological tribes. The interesting part was most people were somewhere what they called this exhausted majority, right? That's where most people were. The problem was the discourse in America was led by the two smallest groups on the extremes. It was led by progressive activists, who were 8% of the population, and devoted conservatives, who were 6% of the population. It showed that these two groups had an outsized voice in our politics. While most people in America didn't agree with them on every issue, they controlled the discourse because they had more money and they had more time to spend dealing with these particular issues. So that has kind of shaped our public discourse in a way that varies from what many Americans would actually engage, all right? So I hope that gives you a good foundation, and the book obviously digs into it more of what this culture war was about. Now, this book is saying we have an example of how to get through this. The proposition of this book here is not that these issues don't matter. What kids learn in sexual education, what defines a marriage, these are issues that people should care about. The question is how we go about it. Do we go about these debates and this discourse in the toxic manner that we are proceeding with now, or do we do it in a way that can be more redemptive and actually respect the dignity of the people who we're disagreeing with? To me, that's what the American experiment is about, but I believe the culture war in many ways, not because the issues don't matter, but because of how we go about it, takes away from that, all right? So I'll be talking about the black church, and I want to be very clear because some people get upset just with the term black church. It's no different than talking about the Dutch Reformed Church, right? It's a point of reference. And if you go throughout history, the reason that there's a black church is because certain people weren't allowed in other churches, in the segregated churches. So it was created for that purpose. It was actually created to start with during slavery when many were not allowed to worship at all. So there is a meaningful distinction. It doesn't mean it's a church separate from the universal church, but it does mean that it's a distinction within that category to help us understand a different tradition. I would also say this too, while the book does point to the civil rights generation and basically ask the question, how would the civil rights generation respond to the culture war? This is not just an exaltation of the black church or any other church either. This is actually a challenge today to all churches, to the black church, to white evangelical churches and all others, to say we have to do better, right? So it's not to say that this church always has it right. It's to say there's a time when that was the case. And so I focus in on this civil rights generation, which in the book, as I narrated, is represented by my maternal grandmother, Willie Faye, who was born in Mississippi, and also her favorite gospel artist, which is Mahalia Jackson. So those are the two characters that are kind of the center of this narrative that I move forward with. And what I want to say about the black church is that there were four things that I just think distinguished the black church from many other churches during that time and now that would help us get through this culture war in a healthier way, in a more faithful way. Four things that would help us get through that. And the first is, I'll list them and then I'll go through them one by one. First is their ability to connect the spiritual with the socio-political. There was no disconnect between their spiritual beliefs and how they interacted with society and with politics. That's number one. Number two, they upheld social justice, as I talked about earlier, and moral order, right? They did not fit, if you look closely enough, they did not fit within the culture war binary of conservative versus progressive. And we'll get to that in a little deeper later. Third, this is a big one. They were able to acknowledge the potential for wickedness in themselves, not just in their political opponents. And fourth, they chose moral imagination over contempt and cynicism. moral imagination over contempt and cynicism. And I think part of this was 2 Corinthians 5:20, which says, we are ambassadors of Christ as though God were making his appeal through us. As they engaged in a way that said, I am God's representative, not only my own representative. In fact, Don gave you some of my definition of a public witness, and I appreciate that. They believed their public witness did not belong to them or their community, that it belonged to God. How different would our tweets look and the things that we share if we thought of ourselves as ambassadors of Christ, as if everything we were saying was a representation of that kingdom? I think we might speak to others a little differently. So those are the 4 areas that I'll be getting into. And just some general differences that you see between them in different churches. So one way that it differed with the white evangelical church is they talked of heaven, they talked of morality, but they didn't limit God's will in the public square to personal piety, right? They believed and recognized that social justice was a required part of the kingdom plan. We see that in the Exodus motif. We see that with many of the prophets from Isaiah to Amos and so on. It was very clear to them that social justice was a part of this conversation. But unlike secularists, they clearly didn't interpret the separation between church and state to be a severing of one's faith from their socio-political engagement. Again, that goes to the first point that I was making. Faith guided and anchored their social action. And unlike today's more social gospel progressive Christians, they believed in the whole counsel of God. And they believed that that counsel of God was more than just a justice imperative. Yes, it was partially a justice imperative, but it also involved biblical tenets about sin and how sin exists in all humanity. And so that was part of their witness. Lastly, I would say it differed significantly even from black secular activism. While it agreed and understood that power concedes nothing without demand, as Frederick Douglass taught us, they believed that one's social actions had to be aspirational, holy, and redemptive. In other words, my goal could not be to destroy or extinguish my opposition. My goal had to be to help redeem my opposition. The belief that they actually could be redeemed. These are some ways that in the public square today and at that time, you saw a difference between this tradition and some of the other traditions, even within the same faith. So let's look a little bit more closely at connecting the spiritual and the socio-political. Because I think there's a lot of groups that you could say, well, they're trying to connect their religion with what they do in their politics. I think there's some wrong ways to do that. One wrong way to do that, I would say, is through Christian nationalism, which would say they're connecting their faith to their politics. The problem is they try to coerce other people into doing the same thing. I believe that we should have the politics of persuasion, where we have to persuade other people in what they should do, not give Christians some type of privilege or preeminence within the socio-political sphere, but actually have to persuade. So I'm not going there, but I do think there should be a strong connection between your faith and your politics. When I walk out of the church, if I heard a sermon about love and I heard a sermon about people who have been displaced and immigrants, that should apply to how I treat people in the public square. It should apply to how I vote. Now, one of the ways you saw this most clearly when it came to the civil rights movement and this black church tradition was through the gospel hymns and old spirituals that they sang during their marches, during their sit-ins, right? These weren't just songs that they sang to pass the time. I want you to know that these became spiritual disciplines. These became much-needed reminders of the foundational principles that they needed to maintain in a very dangerous situation. One thing I want you to understand about the civil rights generation is they walked into these situations very prepared. They had a 4-step process that they would go through before they even engaged in social action. One part of that four-step process was self-purification. That before I engaged anybody in the public square or about culture, I had to make sure that my intentions were right, that my head was clear, and that I was very clear on what my objective was. Was my objective just to get a win, or was my objective to come out of this struggle, wherever it was, looking like Jesus? Two very different approaches, right? Would history say about us that yes, those Christians won, but they were just as mean and opportunistic and nasty and bitter as everybody else? Or would history look back at us and say, those Christians won, and now I know what Jesus is about? Now I know how Jesus would face wickedness, how Jesus would engage someone who could be considered his enemy. That's what this was about. And these songs, although often tirelessly repetitive, were not vainly repetitive. They drove home the point. Lyrics like "Keep Your Eyes on the Prize," which is an adaptation of a plantation song called "Keep Your Hand on the Plow." What this was speaking of was perseverance and how God's promises liberate us from being enslaved by the threats and the trials of the moment. Or you can look at "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around," which is obviously where the title of my book comes from, and I woke up with my mind stayed on Jesus. These songs spoke of the resolve to stay on task and to overcome minor and major setbacks while centering Jesus in every interaction. Let me give you another one. Another song continually repeats, "I'm gonna treat everybody right until I die." How simple. Yet it's profound when you think about the fact that they weren't just talking about people who loved them. They were talking about people who hung their family members and bombed their churches. So to be singing a song like that while you're being attacked by dogs and fire hoses are spraying at you, it's once again a reminder of who you represent and what your ultimate objective is. And as we look at some of the protest and activism today, that's one missing thing. I can almost guarantee you there's no self-purification before we go into these situations. And it's not that being more mean or screaming in someone's face is more effective. It's that we haven't the discipline to not purge in a situation where we need to try to inspire. And I think these songs that they sang were so important in that way. I mean, even if you think of, I'm not gonna let anybody turn me around, I'm gonna treat everybody right until I die. These are penetrating expositions about how those who are committed to seeing the human dignity in everyone will somehow find the image of God in the most hostile representations of human brokenness. This answers the question, how do you see God in someone who hates you? How do you see God in someone screaming expletives at you, who doesn't want you to vote? The only way that you see God in someone like that is you have to want to see it, right? You have to see something that's invisible without faith. You have to love and fear God too much not to see it. You force yourself to do it because you want to. I'm not sure we're seeing the image of God in each other today, but it all comes down to this, as I said before, is our posture one of vengeance or is our posture one of redemption? And they were able to bring their faith into their politics by seeing people differently and responding to them differently, okay? I'll give you an example that I think speaks to this very clearly, which is of Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was going around the South and she was demystifying the political process to black people in Mississippi. And the reason she had to do this was, even though they finally got the right to vote, when you've never had something, it's hard to really understand that it actually exists. Is this real? And so she was basically saying, this is real and this is how you use it. And as she was doing that, she gets pulled over by a highway patrolman, taken into custody, and he has another black inmate, beat her almost to death. Almost beats her to death. And years later, and so after this happens, she gets fined for it, he gets off. So they tried to hold him accountable, he gets off on it, she gets fined after she almost died. And she was asked later on how she felt about that officer. And she said this. She said, I feel sorry for him because he's broken. And America is sick and broken. And Christians have to be the doctor. All of the things that she could have said, he's evil, he's irredeemable, I hate him. No, he's sick. And he needs help. He's broken and he needs help. That's how you change how you look at people. It doesn't mean you don't try to fix the issue, but how do you look at the people who do things that clearly show that they're broken? You embrace that type of perspective. Number 2, again, upholding social justice and moral order. This movement did not fit into the progressive and conservative binary. The interesting thing I learned through my research for the book is around the 1920s, you start to see this split in the white church. You start to see a split between the progressives and the more traditionalists. You see it at your Ivy League institutions that used to be Christian institutions. They start turning and becoming much more progressive, right? The interesting thing was that during this time, if you read the publications from black denominations and what their watchmen were saying, they were actually watching very closely this split. They were seeing, during this time, they're watching it all happen, and they make a very deliberate decision. As they see one side go left and one side go right, they say this in more than one denominational publication. They say, basically, we can't choose either side, because if we go to the right, we lose our bodies, because there's no justice there. If we go to the left, we lose our souls, because they're walking away from the Bible and the authority of Scripture. So I want to be very clear. This wasn't something that they weren't paying attention to, or they just happened to be a little bit different. They deliberately said, these are 2 errors that we're not going to make. That was the perspective that they have. In fact, if you read historian Mary Beth Matthews, she says this. She says that the black church deliberately refused to entirely side with the left or the right in the culture war. The terms liberal and conservative are too binary to be of assistance in trying to understand the black church's theological and political positions. Let me give you an example of what I mean. You have somebody like Fred Shuttlesworth. Fred Shuttlesworth was a friend of Dr. Martin Luther King. He's actually the person that King said was the most courageous person in the movement. And so one story about Shuttlesworth is that I think it was Christmas Eve, and he had planned this bus boycott. And so the KKK bombs his house, blows half of his house up, basically trying to change his calculus. Basically trying to say, this isn't worth it, maybe you should reconsider. Shuttlesworth, being who he was, doesn't reconsider. The next day he goes forward with that bus boycott. You talk about courage, that's courage. But that's not the only thing he was doing. He was also looking at the juke joints in his neighborhood and getting pastors together and other leaders together in his neighborhood to say, we need to shut those juke joints down. Because it's not only the external things that are happening to us, there's some things we have internally that are taking men out of the homes, that are taking money out of the homes, that are bringing degenerate mentalities into the culture. Those need to be addressed as well. The first thing that I mentioned is clearly more of a leftward point of view. The second is more conservative. But this is how they were thinking at the time. They weren't trying to jump to one side or the other. They saw value in both things. And I think this, in some ways, we can even see this in Jesus' ministry. When Jesus comes on the scene, now let's keep in mind, Jesus comes into Roman occupation, right? He comes into this Roman occupation, and he has people within his community reacting differently to this occupation. You had the zealots who wanted to react with violence and terrorism. You had the Herodians who were just trying to assimilate into the culture and show Rome, we could be just like you. You had the Pharisees and the Sadducees who were against the occupation, but opportunistically would use it to maintain the power in their own community too, right? Jesus doesn't say, okay, well, those Sadducees are legalistic. I mean, those Pharisees are legalistic, so I'll just be a Herodian. Or he doesn't say the Herodians are very secular, so I'll just be a Pharisee. No, Jesus brings something very different to the conversation. And what Jesus brings to the conversation forces those who are listening to him to look at themselves differently and look at their enemies differently. And one question I always get, because my organization critiques both conservatism and progressivism, that's what we do. And people who think one side is far worse than the other, and they may be, I'm not saying that it's any type of equivalent. That's not the point I'm making. But they say, well, how could you talk about my side when the other side is doing this, this, and that? And I say the same way that Jesus was under a Roman occupation and he critiqued all the people in his community as well. Because there's always room for self-examination, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit too. But it's never, our position, and I think the position of the civil rights movement, if you see how they moved, it was never just about choosing a side. It was never just saying, you know what, this side gets 6 out of 10 things right, 7 out of 10 things right, I'm just going to go with them. No, you may lean that way, or you may align with them on something, but you couldn't ignore those 3 or 4 other things that were wrong, right? And I think we see room for that in Jesus. Being able to critique and say there's a better way. Don't just take the options that are on the table. Both of those could be lies. Don't just take a side, take the right position. Take the right position. Because if we just take a side, basically what we end up doing is outsourcing our public witness. You get 7 out of 10 things right, I'm going to give you my public witness and you make all the decisions from here because I can't question you now because they're so bad. They took a different point of view, and I think it stands out in what they were trying to do. So one of the things that I would say for us today, because this is about application, is as we go through and we engage within this culture war, being willing, without creating false equivalence, being willing to critique both progressivism and conservatism. If you are a conservative, you should be able to list 10 things that conservatism has gotten wrong throughout history and gets wrong now. If you're a progressive, you should be able to list 10 things that progressives have gotten wrong throughout history and get wrong now. Why? Because it shows you're not indoctrinated. It shows you're not just rubber stamping an ideology made with human hands. It shows that you're thinking through the issues on your own and not being intellectually lazy. I think to be conservative or progressive on every single issue is intellectually lazy. It's questionable. Are you really thinking through every single issue? Because the parties aren't necessarily, and the ideologies aren't necessarily that consistent. They actually move around quite a bit. And if you don't catch that, if you don't challenge that, I think you end up in a tough place. Let's go to number 3. Number 3 is, and this might be the biggest one for the culture war, honestly, today. Acknowledging the potential for wickedness in themselves. Acknowledging the potential for wickedness in themselves. If we go to Luke 18, there's the story of the praying Pharisee. And what happens with the praying Pharisee is he goes to pray, and he says, "Thank God I'm not like those people over there. The robber, the tax collector, and all these other people." Like, "God, you bless me. Thank God I'm not like them." Well, the tax collector who's next to him goes up and bangs on his chest and basically said, "I'm not even worthy to be here. I need you. I'm a bad person." And the Bible says that it was the tax collector who was justified. Not the Pharisee who was paying his tithes and doing all the things he was supposed to do. It was the tax collector because he knew he needed God. And I want to ask you, how many times do we look at our political opponents and basically say, thank God I'm not like them. How often do we act like Jonah in Nineveh and say, I don't want to go speak to them. I don't want them to receive salvation. I don't want them to receive redemption. They're so bad, I don't want God's grace to touch them. Part of the problem I think that we have, and the reason that we come to these conclusions, because I would say none of us would want to be the praying Pharisee, but part of the issue that we have is I think we're working by a broken framework. We work based on a good versus evil framework. And while the praying Pharisee was right, the damage that the tax collector was doing to his community was real. It wasn't ignored. The tax collector was basically sending his own people into debt slavery. He was cheating his own people and keeping them poor on behalf of the Roman government. They wouldn't even let tax collectors in the temple. But he was wrong in that he exalted himself and didn't realize that he too was broken. So this isn't about saying, well, everybody's just as broken, everybody has the same impact on society. No, it's saying their impact may be bad. What's in me that's bad? As I address the issues that the tax collector may be bringing to my community, am I making sure that my heart is pure? I would say that we want to escape that. So we don't want to have a very simple good versus evil framework. Because if we believe in the fall of men, surely our side is not completely good. It may be significantly better than the other side. That may be true. But is it purely good, and is the other side purely evil? The problem with a good versus evil framework is if I believe that I'm totally good, I have no reason to examine myself. One of the things that the civil rights movement understood was that a good cause was never enough. See, I think we tend to identify a good cause and say, well, as long as I take on this good cause and I'm fighting against the bad people, I'm right. That's false. You can't just have a good cause. The spirit of your cause, the methods of your cause must also be good. This is partially the story of Stalin. Stalin starts off actually with a pretty good cause. He was part of a minority group that was being treated terribly. And at some point in his life, he said, Christianity is too weak for me to overcome what I'm trying to overcome. He throws it out and ends up getting his power and killing more people than Hitler did. It wasn't because he didn't initially have a good cause. It's because the spirit of his cause went wrong. And I don't care whether it's social justice, I don't care whether it's the sanctity of life. If the spirit of your cause sours, you're no longer doing a good thing. We have to understand that. So instead of having this good versus evil idea of how to look at things, I think we should have an imago Dei, an original sin view of this, where we see the image of God in others. That means we see their dignity, and if they have the image of God in them, they are redeemable. So all this stuff about any group being irredeemable is the furthest thing from Christian I can think of. It doesn't mean that they can't be harmful. It doesn't mean they're not doing true damage. It does mean that you can never treat somebody as irredeemable and hold them in contempt. Here's the other part of it. The original sin side of it makes me realize the sin in me, that I can go wrong. If you listen to the songs that these civil rights folks were singing, many of the songs were saying, keep us from our own devices. Let me not become evil while fighting evil. Dr. King understood that many times, anytime you're addressing wickedness, you run the risk of becoming evil while fighting evil. And how do we protect ourselves from that? Acknowledging our own sin nature, acknowledging our ability to have a good cause and for it to go awry. That allows me, number one, to examine myself and understand the need to examine myself and what I'm doing all along the way. And it allows me to say, those people are doing some really bad things. It doesn't mean they have nothing to contribute. And it certainly doesn't mean that they're irredeemable. So just like I said, you should be able to list some things that your side, whether it's conservative or progressive, gets wrong. You should be able to name some things throughout history that the other side got right, or a virtue that you wish your side had. If you can't do that, again, I think you're working in this good versus evil framework, which just isn't biblical. I'll say this too. Throughout history, I don't know any group that has proven that they are fit to steward absolute power. And maybe you have some examples, but especially in a democracy, what group has shown that they're fit to steward absolute power without the contribution of the other people that they're actually governing? This is part of the beauty of democracy. I think it realizes that human flaw that we tend to go too far. Look at the culture war. Every time one side gets a leg up, what do? Go too far. They go over the edge, they go to the extreme, and it always ends up backfiring because they don't have the sobriety, they don't have the wisdom, and they don't have the lack of self-interest to actually govern with more integrity. To say, I have this power, but I also have to tamp down on this power for my own good, and especially for the good of others who don't look like me or who have different interests. God gave his people the word, but he didn't give any one group all the answers. And even as Christians, as we look out on society, we better recognize there are people who are not Christian that we can learn a lot from. And I think this movement understands that all cultures have their pathologies. All cultures have things, and that's why we're a body. That's why we need one another, because we have different viewpoints of the gospel. We have different viewpoints of each other. And so when we actually listen, there are opportunities for us to work together. One of the people that I really enjoy pointing out that I think is more obscure than she should be is Nannie Helen Burroughs, who is a 20th century Christian woman who fought for women's rights, fought for civil rights. I mean, spent her life educating, especially young girls, was very committed to that, very committed to social justice and civil rights, but also criticized some churches who wouldn't speak out against degeneracy. Like what kind of, she says, what kind of church are we if we're not willing to speak out against those things that tear apart families and tear apart souls, right? It wasn't just leaning to one side, and because now I said I'm progressive, I can never have any conversations about sin. I can never have any conversation about how our own cultures can devour us internally, and that's everybody's culture, right? We need to be able to have those conversations to move forward in a better way. Don, about how much time do I have left? Okay. So we'll go to the last one, which is moral imagination. Moral imagination. Historian Andrew Manis, who wrote a great biography on Fred Shuttlesworth, he said this. He said, African-American spirituality looks disappointment and despair and death in the face and declares that beyond all these, there is hope. This is the core, this is the essence of the civil rights movement, right? We know that Romans 8:24-25 says, faith is hoping and believing in what we do not yet have based on God's promises. So moral imagination, as I see it, moral imagination is what keeps us from being arrested by the moment. And I think a lot of Christians are arrested by this moment. The moment's big. We're not supposed to ignore the moment, but we can't let our principles and our beliefs be thrown away in this moment as if this moment is the exception to everything that we've always believed, right? Moral imagination is the ability to see not just what's happening right now, not just what's happened throughout history or what's likely to happen in the future. Moral imagination is the ability to see what ought to be. How ought things go? And to be able to act on that, right? Moral imagination is our ability to be in a tough situation and maintain our principles and not throw everything away in that moment. Let me give you an example of this, because a lot of times, again, I think history gives us perspective. Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to run for president. In 1972, she's running for president, and one of the people that she's running against is the governor of Alabama, George Wallace. And during that campaign, George Wallace actually gets shot in an assassination attempt. So interestingly, after he gets shot, Shirley Chisholm stops her campaign and goes to visit him. Now, I want to remind you, she's going to visit somebody who did not want her to even vote, did not really even want her to be a citizen. I'm sure called her all kind of names, didn't have a problem with her people getting hung and killed in his own state. That's what we're talking about. She goes to see this guy. And so she steps into the hospital room, and somehow she tells him that she's sorry for what happened to him. I'm sorry this happened to you. It shouldn't have happened. But she doesn't only stop there. She tells him, I've listened to you, and there's actually some things that we agree on. She says, I agree that businesses have too much, these large companies have too much power in our democracy. I agree that the small guy is being taken advantage of. We have these agreements. So what I'm telling you is, throughout all the racism he was spewing and all the negativity and vitriol he was spewing at her community, somehow this woman who knew people who had been lynched and knew people whose rights had been taken away from them, looks at this man and says, not only am I coming to visit you, I was able to filter through your hatred and see something that you were right about. And it broke him down. It broke him down so bad that soon after he goes on an apology tour. He goes around the South apologizing for his views and the things that he put out into the public square. The point that I'm making right now is, without moral imagination, she has no reason to even approach him. Without moral imagination, there's nothing in her line of sight telling her that George Wallace is going to go around on an apology tour. That's the power of the gospel. That's what happens when people put the gospel before themselves when they go into the public square. It does things you don't expect that it can do. That's exactly what's missing from the culture war. I can only imagine what people could have been saying when they heard that she's going to visit George Wallace. Why are you wasting your time? Why would you put yourself in that situation with somebody like that? Why do you care that he got shot? So not to only feel compassion for him, through all this time to have been able to listen to him and pull something out of there that was actually redeemable. I don't know a better example to tell you about what this generation was about and what really following the gospel when you're in the public square can do. We don't have to talk about this in theory. We don't just have to say, well, it seems if we were good and nice people, we could do better. No, we have proof of concept through a group of people who were so self-sacrificial that they left us with this legacy that we have to hold on to. What difference would it make if we looked at our opponents in the same way Shirley Chisholm looked at George Wallace? I believe that provides the answer to the culture war we're facing today. Thank you.
We have some time for questions, and our tradition is always to offer the first crack at questions to our students. And we ask, when you ask a question, if you can give us your name and your discipline or your major. And, yeah, you can come up to that. Yep. Questions?
Hi, my name is Warner. I'm a second-year law student here. Okay. My question is, you began talking about persuasion and about how a view, certainly the moderating influence of looking to the other side and seeing the value in their arguments. I think it's a popular argument right now to kind of reject that and to say that we've been doing that for a while, that the liberal project has led us to where we are now, so what good is the rule? And when that is in vogue, this rejection of liberalism, how do you bring back friends who might see that as a deteriorating force when there's evidence in their view of their argument? Mm-hmm. How do you say that, no, actually this project is good, we're on a long track to maybe make things better, but they might not quite be sympathetic to the argument that there's value to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, I almost think this is a question of patriotism, right? The American experiment, while very much influenced by Christianity, is a pluralist experiment. I mean, if you can't deny that as you read through the Constitution, right? Which is what this is about. It was the idea that different people could come together and live at peace and make it work. That's the democratic experiment. And so I would, number one, remind them of that. That's what this experiment is about. And then I would also, and this goes along with what I was saying a little bit earlier, I would ask them, because I think both sides have had their try at it, right? Both sides have been in, maybe not absolute power, but they've had significant control. And I would ask, how did that turn out? Did we get this utopian society where one group or another wasn't being treated poorly? I don't think they can answer that to say that either side, and this is partially my issue with Christian nationalism. Where does the credibility come from for you to tell everybody else what to do and how to live? I don't think a good case could be made that either side has proven that they're apt to be able to do that. So that's one thing that I would point out. And I don't think there's really a true alternative. So we say liberalism is dead. Well, what do you do? Do all the progressives just disappear? Do all the conservatives just disappear? This is what we have. We can theorize about changing it in drastic ways that I think are a little far-fetched. How can we make this work? I think there are tweaks that we can make, but I think the idea that it's just all over is sort of a cop-out. It's giving up on something that is at the heart and the essence of what America is and what this democratic experiment is about. So I don't think it's necessarily realistic, and I don't think either side can claim that if they had controlled everything, we'd be in a better position today. I think it's actually those statesmen, those more sober voices who kept us within the lines, and I hope we still have some of those statesmen out there to get us back there.
Next question, right over there.
Thank you. I'm a junior double majoring in philosophy and political science. And I had a question, you kind of touched on it as far as application. As far as when we look at the times we're in now and we're looking at, okay, you open up media and you're looking at all the lives lost. And we can say on both sides, we're looking at a lot of lives being lost. How do you teach the discipline of having this, okay, let's call back to Christ. Let's look back at what we know. And I know especially being a Black student, being at a PWI, a lot of times when we look at the civil rights era, it's a lot of people that are like, oh, they were better than me. They were better than me to keep saying, when you take MLK versus Malcolm X, and it's okay, MLK was better than me to keep just speaking the fight when you're watching your lives lost or you're going to a white school where you feel like the outcast. So how do you teach this discipline? And I think a lot of times, especially recently, there's this narrative oh, Democrats are too soft. Everything about them is too soft. We like to kumbaya, every response. And there's this narrative that oh, Republicans are strong and they're putting their foot down to show you what they're about. But how do you teach that discipline? And then also as young adults, going into this world where we can vote, but we're not running for office yet. Yeah. So where do we play a role in this discipline? Where do we play a role in trying to call back on our ancestors and those before us? So yeah.
No, that's a good question. And I think that's why proof of concept is important. The civil rights movement isn't just a theory, it's proof of concept. in that it was more effective than the alternatives that they saw, right? Civility, people have to understand civility is not weakness. One of the problems that we have today is we think it's authentic to go out and have a public temper tantrum and vent and tell people how stupid they are and how they're never going to get anything right and how irredeemable they are. No one's ever been convinced by people talking to them like that. You may vent, you may feel better, you may get a pat on the back from your side. You're not convincing anybody. And as long as you live in this republic, you're going to have to persuade people. So that's the first thing that I say. We live under this false idea that reacting in a more vitriolic way is more effective. How? And I would say this too, the people that say, oh, we should be more belligerent, we should be more militaristic or whatever, most of those people have no idea what war is like and have no preparation to put their people in the middle of something that would get extremely ugly. We can talk about, just war theory and all that. Most people who are talking like that have no idea what would happen if this became war. And that's what I tell people. What is we act like civility is weakness. What is the alternative? The alternative to civility is war. You better be very sure that you're ready for that outcome, that you're ready to put your people who you're selling wolf tickets to in that situation. I don't think that most people are. And so that's one thing that people, let's be realistic. It doesn't mean there are no times for that. If we can avoid it, we should try to avoid it, okay? And then it's much harder to do what Dr. King did. I would say, and I have an appreciation for Malcolm X and many of the things he did, he persuaded far less people. Because what King did was he took the time, not holding any punches, to be artful in how he talked to people. Not just to keep them outraged, but to inspire them. It takes time not to only inspire your people, but to inspire people who thought they hated you. There's probably many people in here today, if it wasn't for Dr. King and the way that he approached it, them and their family might think very differently about race today, but he inspired people. And that takes time. That's not easy. It's not like physically grabbing somebody and making them do what you want to do, but it's a much more persuasive and effective way, especially in a representative democracy where you have to persuade people. That's the only way to get things done. These temper tantrums don't get it. They may feel good momentarily, they don't get it done. And so I think it's helping people understand that this discipline is more effective than the alternative, which may seem authentic today.
Hi, I'm Kieran. I'm a freshman political science student. First off, I completely agree that civility is always the way to go. But I want to ask, A, do you think civility is always effective? And if not, what do you think we should do if civility is not effective? Like, how do we approach conversations with someone that might disagree with you, especially when they're not very receptive to our own ideas?
Yeah, so in an individual, in like interpersonal conversation, someone who doesn't listen to you just can't go into every conversation thinking you're going to persuade somebody to think differently. What I do know, and part of what I'm saying is, if you go up to that person and say they're stupid or imply they're stupid or evil, they're never going to listen to you. I think a better way to go about it is to actually hear what they have to say. If there's anything that you can affirm in that, try to affirm it and just build the relationship. Sometimes you just have to get to know people and understand their perspective. One of the issues, and I said this earlier today, that I think we have is most people, no matter how wrong they are, so we're not saying everybody's good, but most people do not see themselves as malicious, right? They see themselves at trying to attain some good. And we can disagree with their premise or their conclusion on that. I think what we have to be able to do before we can have a constructive conversation with them is be able to explain what good they see. And we argue with people today before we've even taken the time to understand what good they're trying to actually get at. Again, these things take time. Anybody who wants to come into a conversation or come in on an issue and change people's mind in 6 months, good luck to you. It's not that simple, but I think when you are in relationship with people, you can start to understand where they're coming from. And maybe at the end of the day, they convince you, right? But it's really about the relationship. You can't go into there's no tool I can give you to say, hey, with this tool, everybody that thinks you're dead wrong is going to agree with you. I can try to help you understand where they're coming from, and then maybe you can have a constructive conversation about what you're both trying to get at.
Next question. We have two of them back there.
Hi, my name is Wakabo. I'm an architecture major. And my question is similar to one of the earlier ones about just the younger generation now. And I know we're talking about looking at the civil rights movement and all of that. And I wonder what you're not saying, or what you are still encouraging us to still engage with politics, even as we are Christians or with our faith. And I wonder if, sorry, I'm saying this as I'm thinking, but we're not saying don't vote, and we're also saying be critical about both sides or whatever number of sides. And so in moments like that where you're still thinking about these things and neither side seem like, oh, this is absolute, what is the way forward? And so even now, as I'm developing my own political views and trying to understand how Christ would go about these things, when either side doesn't seem absolute and I still want to vote, what does that look like?
That's a good question. So let me be very clear about one thing. I don't think there's necessarily any inherent virtue in being in the middle, right? Like, this isn't a fence-sitting philosophy. I don't think there's necessarily anything virtue about this, because sometimes we're in the middle because we're trying to avoid the issue. We're trying to sit in, right? We're being neutral because we don't want to really enter the fray. I actually think that can be sinful as well. What I'm proposing more so is not neutrality, but impartiality. Holding people, parties, leaders to the same standard, not changing our standard. If we look around, we see people change their standard based on who they're talking about, right? So that's one part of it. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I do want to be clear about that. As far as how you vote when you don't think either side is perfect, one of the things I said this morning was, I think it's a good practice to list your top 10, top 5, top 10 issues, and then just see where those particular candidates land on those issues. And again, this is not about taking the middle ground, avoiding it. I still want you to engage with tenacity. I mean, if you look at with the civil rights movement, they weren't just sitting on their hands. This wasn't escapism. They were really engaging. It's how you engage. And I think thoughtfully, when you're not sure who to vote for, list those things out, and whoever hits more of those 10 things or higher in priority, then that may be the one you should go with. And I think that's how you get around it. It's not about being so indecisive that you just can't make a decision. It's saying, if I see a problem with conservatism, or if I see a problem with progressivism, that doesn't mean the opposite is the answer. One thing that I got from C.S. Lewis, which I always use and has stayed on my mind since I read it, was that he says the enemy sends errors in pairs, and he uses our dislike of one error to force us into the opposite error. So what he's saying is, when we see one error, we normally don't correct it. We go all the way to the opposite. So I get mad at the church, I run into the arms of the far left. I get mad at them, I run into the arms, instead of providing a correction. And so I think if we think of politics, if we think of just the issues that we see in politics that way, we're looking for something different, not just kind of an opposition-centered way of viewing politics. So I hope that's helpful.
Tyler, our last question.
Okay, thanks for your talk, Justin. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question about how you and the civil rights generation think about time. You said a lot about the need for patience, to have a longer-term perspective, to not be in the mindset where, like, this current moment is so urgent, so important that I'm going to do anything at all costs to win or get whatever outcome I want, because that can lead us to bad things. But you also have MLK famously in the letter from the Birmingham jail criticizing the white moderates who were not acting, and said, let's not create tension or turmoil. Let's slow things down. The status quo is okay. You're being too much of a radical, being too much pushing urgency. So how do we, think about time, maybe drawing from the civil rights generation broadly?
Yeah, I think time is of the essence. I think you have nothing that I said would take away that you should have a sense of urgency when it comes to injustice, when it comes to the suffering of your neighbors. That's an immediate need. It needs an immediate response. So this isn't just sit around and wait. No, we can have conversations. The conversation, that doesn't mean that I'm not going out the next day and protesting this or voting against that you have. We're still having a civil conversation, but guess what? I'm out in the streets doing what I need to do, trying to secure change, and maybe even fighting against you in the legislature the very next day, right? So there has to be a sense of urgency, but the urgency isn't everything. The urgency can't take over to cause me to have a by any means necessary attitude. That's just not Christian. How the means in Christianity is just as important as the ends. That process and the modes and methods that I use is just as important as everything else in Christianity. It's not, the urgency is not a justification for me doing things that go outside of Christian principles. So there has to be that sobriety, there has to be that discipline, but I think that you'll find that that discipline and the urgency, although it's a tough tension to be in, they're not necessarily opposed to one another, right? They're not always in conflict. And so you have to live in that tension between the urgency I have, but the principles I have. And we can go throughout history over and over again when the urgency takes over and the principles go out the window. One by one, we can name the biggest monsters in history that actually started off well and ended in a completely disastrous, monstrous way. That is very clear to me throughout history.
My friends, we've reached the end of our time together, and we have 3 thank yous to impart. The first one is to all of you for being here and for exceptional questions that you guys asked. Secondly, to our co-sponsors, the Departments of Africana Studies, Theology, and for the Initiative on Race and Resilience. And then lastly, please join me in thanking our presenter, Justin Giboney, for a wonderful talk.